whom I returned for information, described the man with some skepticism and even disrespect as, quote, an Arab general. Aunt Nabiha's mode was often plaintive and scandalized soon after she appeared in Cairo. When she described the horrors of Deir Yassin, say, naked girls taken through their camps on the backs of trucks, I assumed she was expressing not the horror of a horrendous cold-blooded massacre of innocent civilians, but the shame of women being exposed to male eyes. I could not at the time imagine whose eyes they were. A certain formality kept the extended family's relationships as they once were. But I remember detecting fault lines, little inconsistencies and lapses that had not been there before. All of us seem to have given up on Palestine, never returned to, barely mentioned, missed silently and pathetically. I was old enough to notice and recall, for instance, that my father's cousin, Zbir Shammas, a patriarchal figure of authority and prosperity in Jerusalem, now appeared in Cairo as a much older and frailer man, always wearing the same suit and green sweater, his bent cane bearing his large, slow bulk as he lowered it painfully and slowly into the chair, in which he sat for the most part silently. His two unmarried daughters were attractive young women, one of whom worked as a secretary in the Canal Zone, the other in Cairo. His two sons were fractious, loud men whom I liked, but whose new insecurity expressed itself in loud, blustery attacks on Egyptians, Britishers, Greeks, Jews, and Armenians. Their mother had become a tremendous complainer, her high-pitched voice shrill with the difficulties of paying bills, finding a decent house, looking for work, and the like. We paid them the first of two visits in Cleopas in a many-story, dingy apartment building with peeling walls and no elevator. I recall being alarmed at the relative emptiness of the flat and the air of forlorn lostness that seemed to belong nowhere it conveyed. My mother never mentioned what had happened to them, though they seemed so dramatically reduced and pathetic. I didn't ask my father. I had no available vocabulary for the question, but I was obviously able to sense something wrong and radically changed. Only once did my father, in a sweeping way, elucidate the general tradition, when he remarked about Zbir and his family that they had lost everything. A moment later he added, "We lost everything too." I remarked that I didn't quite understand what he meant, since our style of life in Cairo, in effect, seemed to have remained the same. Palestine, was all he said. He had never much liked the place, it is true, although he was from there. But this peculiarly rapid monosyllabic acknowledgement and equally quick burial of the past was typically, indeed I've come to believe ideologically, his alone. What is past and irrevocable. The wise man has enough to do with what is present and to come, he often said. Then he quickly added Lord Bacon as an authoritative seal to a kind of bin into which he put everything he didn't want to discuss. I never failed to be impressed by this stoic turning of his back on the past, even when its effects remained in the present. But it was mainly my Aunt Nabiha who provided us not only with workers, but who kept, stories about workers, but who kept the misery of Palestine intermittently before us. She would have lunch with us every Friday. I recall her dynamic presence, although she was a very short, tiny woman, and how she would describe the rigors of a week spent, because she made her whole life working for refugees by herself, how she would describe the rigors of a week spent visiting refugee families in Shubra, badgering callous government authorities about work and residence permits for her refugee family, and tirelessly going from one charitable agency to another in search of funds. It seems so inexplicable to me now that having dominated our lives for generations, the problem of Palestine, in particular its tragic loss, that affected virtually everyone we knew and had so deeply changed our world, should have been as completely repressed and left undiscussed or even remarked on by my parents and family. Palestine, after all, was where they were born and grew up, even though their life in Egypt and more continuously Lebanon provided a new setting for them. As children, my sisters and I were cloistered away from what my mother used to refer as bad people, as well as anything that might have disturbed what she called our little heads. But the repression of Palestine in our lives occurred, I think, as part of a larger depoliticization, indeed a hatred of and distrust of politics as a subject or realm that people like us, too precarious in Egypt for participation or even open discussion, might talk or do something about. Politics always seemed to involve other people, not us. When I began to be involved in politics 20 years later, both my parents strongly disapproved. "It will ruin you," said my mother. "You're a literature professor," said my father. "Why don't you stick to that?" His last words to me a few hours before he died were, "I'm worried what the Zionists will do to you. Be careful." Except for my mother, my sisters, father, and I were protected by our talismanic American passports, so that even those green booklets had the power to allow us to avoid politics, as we slipped by customs and immigration officials with what appeared to be laughable ease, leaving behind the less endowed lives of less fortunate people in those war and post-war years. So it was in 1947 and 48. And the thing that I remember the most, to conclude this personal segment, is that it seemed to me like, since I had no conception of politics, I was 12, I didn't know what they were, but it seemed to me like a gigantic medical emergency. Everybody who had been affected by it seemed ill in some way. And my aunt went around finding medicines for people, and doctors, of course, and so on. And the effect of Palestine then was, first of all, this medical emergency, and second, very important to me, has remained with me, because of the example of my aunt, who devoted her life to the refugees. She was a widow, she was quite well off. And immediately after she arrived in Cairo, that's all she did. She took care of, there were no agencies, there were no, NGOs, there was nothing. There were 130,000, 140,000 refugees in Egypt. Most of them, all of them, without permits, without ability to work, totally disoriented. She somehow took charge of them. And this impressed me tremendously. She did it for there was no reward for her, except that she felt it was her duty. So the second biggest idea that I had as a result of those years was that Palestine equals service. That it's not about making a career or making a speech or anything like that, but it's something you do to help others in this unfortunate, terrible calamity that happened to a whole people. Now, this experience has been very important to all Arabs, I think. And what is striking, and this is really the theme of most of my comments, the rest of my comments today, what is striking to me is how little of that has made its way into the Jewish or Zionist consciousness, with a few exceptions. Alfred Lilienthal being one of them. That is to say, that there was another side to this terrible, to the creation of this new state, Israel. And it was a terrible catastrophe for the people whose lives were destroyed and whose society was eliminated in 1948. Look, for instance, at a recent appendix in the New Republic, which is not my favorite magazine. It's strange. My doctor, who's a very brilliant Indian, and works where I'm treated at Long Island Jewish Hospital in New York, told me once that he was completely brainwashed. He's married to a Jewish woman. He knew, although he was Indian, he is Indian, he knew nothing about this question, except what he read in the New Republic, and of course heard from his Jewish friends and so on and so forth. So a couple of years ago, I arranged for him to go to Year's Eve when he was at a convention, a hematological meeting in Israel, and it changes mind completely. I mean, he came around. And one of the results of this, which I'm happy to announce today, is that he canceled his subscription for the New Republic. Because he said they were always attacking me, but I feel it's possible for you. I can't allow them to attack you and unsubscribe. Anyway, early this September, they published a symposium, which is called Zionism of 100, in the New Republic. What is... Well, I mean, there's a long article by the egregious and indescribably unregenerate Martin Peretz, which goes on about how great Israel is and Zionism is and all the rest of it. But the rest of the articles, there are about 10 of them, and they're quite long, from many distinguished people, including Daniel Bell and Michael Ignatieff, not all of them Jewish, Krauthammer, Walter Lacour, and so on and so forth, David Price Jones, saying what an important thing it is and so on and so forth. But what struck me is the almost total absence of any consciousness that the successes of Zionism are intimately related to the depredations and deprivations and catastrophes that have happened to the Palestinians during these 100 years. There isn't a single mention. And I want to just take one example, because he's somebody I know and think well of, a man called Leon Botstein, who's the president of Bard College. He's a conductor. And he's an intellectual, he's not a slight person. He's some substance. He appears on television. He's sort of thoughtful, etc. And although I've known him for a long time, his sister was a student of mine at Harvard. We've never really discussed Middle East. Although he's implied to me that he's a kind of liberal Zionist and is quite critical of Israeli occupation policies and so on and so forth. But at the end of his intervention in this symposium, The New Republic, this is what he says. Yet the legacy of the Zionism of 1897 remains with us in two key respects. And pay attention here to the absence of understanding of what, in a certain sense, he's talking about. First, these are the two respects in which the legacy of Zionism remains with us. First, Zionism, even as a code word, is the litmus test with respect to anti-Semitism throughout the world, even in America. The facile, rhetorical linkage of Zionism with imperialism and racism is little more than an admission that Jews are uniquely not entitled to be like everyone else and live as citizens as part of a majority in a nation, for better or for worse. Zionism is mere than the state of Israel has proven the point that Jews are in fact just human. Israel has displayed a full range of human achievement and weakness and of decency, and its absence common to all nations. Comparatively speaking, one can make the case that Israel has behaved better given its circumstances. And the second important thing, he says, is that Israel has the second legacy of Zionism, is that Zionism is a doctrine central to which is a belief in an inclusive definition of who is a Jew and a firm conviction in the secular, non-discriminatory, democratic character of the Jewish state. Now, some of this is true, there's no question about it. But what is astonishing is that after 100 years of a continually unresolved, to a certain extent unreconcilable encounter between Zionist Jews in Israel and Palestinian Arabs, that this sort of half-truth and blind material can still be formulated by people of perfectly good sense on every other issue that you can imagine. So there is some problem here which suggests to me, now I come to the second part of what I want to say, that despite its achievements, and they are considerable, I think it would be wrong to look at Israel today not as a passing phenomenon, but as a state with considerable achievements of its own, but a state that is a tremendous impasse, kind of lost. I mean, I think that in spite of all the achievements which have been celebrated, I don't need to celebrate them here, but are real. An Air Force, an army of extraordinary power, an education system, a relatively democratic system compared to surrounding states, for Jews, of course. It has great ideas and influence in the world. In spite of all this, there is a kind of fundamental, in my opinion, loss. There's a kind of fundamental absence at the core of the whole thing, which is quite striking, which these symposia at the New Republic cannot seem to see. I think it's important to focus on. One example is to look at the failed attempt to kidnap the Hamas leader in Jordan the other day, which looks like a kind of bungling kind of thing, although I know Hamas has a conspiracy theory. Of course, people have suggested that there's a conspiracy behind it that is not. But I think it's accurate to see it as a continuing series of kind of clumsy interventions in the lives of other states that Israel practices. It's a way of showing contempt for the Arabs and the locale in which it is to be found. This is, of course, Netanyahu's view. But if they don't like it, well, what can they do about it? If the Americans don't like it, too bad for them. We're going to push our way around. We're going to do what we want. And this is, as I say, has been a long standing policy of the states. This interventionary, contemptuous attitude to Egypt, to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Syria, maintained through assassinations, through kidnapping, not only kidnapping of Arabs, but kidnapping of Jews. Think of Benunu being kidnapped on the streets of Rome. Invasions, like the invasion of Lebanon in 1982. All of this maintaining what Ben-Gurion, when he was offered peace by the Arabs in 1949, always turned down because he thought it was better for Israel to be maintained in a state of siege, that it could grow and develop more if it wasn't connected to the Levantinization or Arabization that was going on all around. Yet at the same time, along with this attitude of contempt which we see in Netanyahu and his policies, is this other quite extraordinary strain, which is that Israel wants acceptance and normalcy. And what is puzzling to me is the failure of making the connection between the two, that you can't have normalcy, you can't have normalization, you can't have a sense of acceptance and security if at the same time you're kicking people around and doing what you want with the scantest attention to the damage you're causing to human beings, among whom are the Palestinians, but also all the others. What the meaning of the occupation of South Lebanon, the continuing hold on the Golan Heights seems to be maintaining. This is something Netanyahu Sr., Netanyahu's father, wrote a book about. The Jews cannot live with other people, but they must always live in a state of apartness and exclusiveness. But attached to that is this quite peculiar and paradoxical sense that they want to be accepted. And one of the fantasies I've had, I've written about this, is like having conversations with some of these leaders whom I've never met, of course, probably never will meet, like Peres and Rabin, and the contemporary ones, Begin and Netanyahu, and saying to them, how long can you keep this up? How long can you continue to show contempt and use force to deal with the Arabs? And what is your goal? What is it you expect? That in the end, the Arabs will thank you, will love you, come to accept you because of your power and force? Or do you think they'll just simply go away and stop bothering you? What is the logical conclusion of all of this? How long can it go on? And I think this is really where the fundamental problem for Israel is today, and it's even more acute and more pronounced. And this is something I think that all of us as Arabs should pay very close attention to, which is that Israel is also now beginning to crumble around the notion of what is a Jew. Here's a Jewish state, with a whole series of basic laws for Jews, for immigration, for owning of land, etc., employment, and so on. And yet there seems to be a fundamental, a very radical disagreement on the notion of what is a Jew. And what does it mean now to be a Jew if it doesn't, A, to be opposed to non-Jews, which is really the policy of the state with regard to Palestinians and others in the area, but is also the beginning of an important rift between Jews themselves as to who is a Jew and who isn't a Jew. It seems to me this fundamental debate inside Israel is worth watching because it is a sign of in my opinion, the epistemological and moral impasse which Israel, after 50 years, almost 50 years, has come. I think one ought to pay very close attention to that. If we look on the other side, 80 years after Balfour, the Arab situation is equally parlous, is equally depressing.